Hey everybody, I wanted to talk a little bit about this album, Eat a Peach by the Allman Brothers. I believe it's a 1972 album. And I just ordered this album. It used to belong to Bob. I won't say your name, but Bob, if you're out there, I've got your old album. It looks like it's a well-loved album that's stood the test of time. Kind of like some of those old albums I had. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the music, but I also want to say a little bit about the awesome album cover inside, the album cover art by Flournoy Holmes. Now, we'll look at this more carefully in a minute, and I'll kind of zero in on some awesome details. You've got the track listing up there. But before we do that, I wanted to say a little bit about this version of Eat a Peach I have that I bought in the late 80s. And I also bought this album, Beginnings, in the late 80s, right around the same time. So this would be around the last days of vinyl. And this shows like when vinyl, and they didn't have much on the internet yet, but everything was going to CD back then. And finally it got so you could hardly get a vinyl album. But this was kind of when you still could get vinyl around, but they were really cutting corners. So I had the full gatefold version, you know, with the Flournoy Holmes art in it in high school. Somehow that album and I lost track of each other over the years. So in the late 80s, I bought the album again, and it was this version. And I think it's interesting. It tells us a little bit about the history of vinyl. There's no gatefold. It's just got two albums in there, not much of a sleeve. So you lost all that crediting information. You don't even really get who wrote what songs. You just get dedicated to a brother, Duane Allman, produced by Tom Dowd. Of course, he was on so many great records, but he produced a bunch of Cream and Derek and the Dominoes, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. But that's kind of interesting. And by the way, this is a similar album. This Beginnings album I bought, but it was really the first Allman Brothers album from 1969 and Idlewild South. So, like in 1990, you would buy this, and it was kind of a double album. But again, you didn't really get the, gatefold. And this was basically the first two Allman Brothers albums, just released in one sleeve. So you lost a lot of the photography, those cool photos that they had on those first two albums. Those kind of, So, but this is Idlewild South in the first Allman Brothers album. I think they're in the same order, but I'm not even sure. But anyway, this is basically the first two Allman Brothers albums. And like I said, they were just released. They were re-releasing these as kind of bare bones records right at the end of the time when vinyl was, you could still buy it in the stores. But everybody was going to CDs, so I bought these. I never was too big on CDs. Now, I had the full Eat a Peach in high school, and I always remembered how cool the gatefold art. I wouldn't have called it a gatefold in high school, but I do remember it. And then for years you couldn't see it. And I saw another guy talk about this album, and he said the same thing, that all through the 90s and early 2000s, you really couldn't see this. It wasn't available. There was no internet. You couldn't Google it. So this great art from this album by Georgia artist Flournoy Holmes was kind of disappeared. And I remember that pretty specifically because I remember wishing what was that picture again? Oh yeah, there was a cool picture on there. And I remember like looking at it and kind of trying to look at all the details. And for years you couldn't see it. It was nowhere. It just kind of disappeared. And before, when CDs came out, but before there was Napster and streaming, a lot of music was like that. I remember a lot of music I grew up with, a lot of Detroit bands like Mitch Ryder, the Rockets, a lot of albums, they'd gone out of print and they were never done in CD. And it was kind of similar. And so the internet has really changed music for the better and for the worse. But anyway, I finally got this album cover again because I was thinking about Eat a Peach. I just ordered it off eBay. The album's kind of beat up, but I paid $25 for it. because I wanted to make this video. But this is Flournoy Holmes. Now, Flournoy Holmes was a contemporary of Greg Allman, Dwayne Allman. He also did album covers for Charlie Daniels. The other day I did that Southern Rock thing. Flournoy Holmes did the album cover art for Fire on the Mountain. He did the album cover art for Wet Willie, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a while. And a bunch of other things. I think the Christopher Cross album. So he's got quite a list of album covers, and it just reminds me of how much cool album cover art and art was a part of rock and roll, like poetry was. You know, rock and roll in those few years was an art movement, almost like romanticism or something. There was poetry, there was cool art, and it had its own style, like all great art movements and in history. And this is certainly the case. So this is Flournoy Holmes. Just an awesome, awesome picture. Very much a product of the hippie age. I saw a thing about Flournoy Holmes. He said that he was I think he was the first person who was kicked off an athletics team at the University of Georgia because he wouldn't cut his hair. I thought, man, times have changed. I sort of remember that when, like, cutting your hair was like a big no-no. It's almost like a political statement against the war or something. I think that's because there was a draft sometimes, I think. But anyway, he was an awesome artist. He's also got a group called the Flying Mystics, and I think I'm going to go see them when I see them. And he's in Atlanta. But he's kind of one of those people in rock and roll that didn't play well. He actually plays the flute really well, so I shouldn't say he wasn't a musician, but he became known for art. And but he was, and there was a bunch of art like this, and I remember that it was hippie art. It was rock and roll hippie art, and it was really cool. And there was a bunch of it. You look like on the West Coast, like some of those old Janis Joplin albums and stuff. You'll see it too. But anyway, let's zoom in a little bit and look at this. Look at all the detail. There you've got the great track listings. What a good album. Ain't Wasting Time No More. Les Brers in A minor. That's a good one. That's kind of like Elizabeth Reed, maybe as good as, and I don't think you hear it quite as much. But it's a kind of one of those Dickie Betts minor jazz flavored, not jazz, but jazz flavored kind of minor blues compositions. Sweet Melissa, of course, everybody knows that one. Then on side 2 and side 4, you got Mountain Jam. And if you watch that Southern Rock thing I did, that's what kind of reminded me. Mountain Jam is like 2 whole album sides, and it was basically the Fillmore East. So Eat a Peach is basically half live album. I mean, that's a full live album you get with this. And it's that epic, epic Mountain Jam. And on that other video, I say, the Allman Brothers used to play from like 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. I don't even know if you could get away with that today. And Mountain Jam is just a rare specimen of those epic jams they used to do. How lucky were people to be there at that time, and the time of freedom, a time of music, a time of cultural flourishing. But that Mountain Jam, that's a specimen of a world you can't go back to. So listen to it and enjoy. Side 3 has One Way Out. That's a great old Elmore James song. Trouble No More, I believe, is Muddy Waters. I hope I'm not getting those backwards. Stand Back, Blue Sky. Got to be some of the nicest Southern country melodic rock ever. Both Dwayne and Dickie playing great. And Little Martha, that beautiful little acoustic song. I like to play Little Martha, and I've learned it before, but the tuning, I think it's open E tuning, and I never like to put my guitars in that tuning. So, but anyway, our focus is kind of the Flournoy Holmes album art. Let me try to. I'm just doing this with my cell phone. I've decided that in some ways these simple videos where I just look at albums turn out better and they're easier, but I don't want to screw it up here. But one theme, hope we don't have to ask the kids to leave the room. One theme is, for some reason, he has highlighted the theme of the mushroom. which seem to have a kind of magical fairy tale like characteristic here. I don't know what that means. Sort of these mushrooms seem to have a magical like effect on people. You can speculate. You know, several years ago, I was in like I had to, you know, deal with some young people and not in law enforcement, but it was sort of like that. And some kids have been caught in a cemetery not too far from here. I forget what time of year it was, but they had a little Tupperware jar full of mushrooms they'd been picking. And I'm not sure what they wanted to do with those mushrooms, but they got in a fair amount of trouble, but I always found them sort of sympathetic young guys there, just trying to enjoy nature a little bit, get outside and pick some mushrooms. I hope they knew what they were doing. But look at that album art. Wow, just unbelievable. Got details. Look at that. Wonder Graphics. There's Flournoy, Holmes, and D. Powell. I don't know that much about him. Flournoy Holmes always gets the credit, but I saw a thing that where Flournoy Holmes, there's some interviews with him on the internet, YouTube, and he said that their idea was that they jammed on this painting just like the Allman Brothers jammed in with guitars and instruments, which is an extremely cool concept. So this painting is a jam. Eat a peach mushroom jam. There you've got the mushroom man bringing the mushrooms to people, I guess. Somebody else interpreted this as somebody is messing with the water supply there. He's putting something in the water. It's going down to the river into town. Maybe that's why everybody's in such a good mood down there. Not advocating any of that, but it's part of the history of the time. And if you take that element out, you don't understand that period. The war, the civil rights movement, but also that hippie element, which the Allman Brothers were Southern. Like a lot of Southern rock, it was kind of rednecky, but it was also kind of hippie. Leonard Skinner, I think especially, had that kind of, and Charlie Daniels, but even the Allman Brothers, you know, it was very Southern, you know, very proudly Southern, but also very hippie. And somebody said that's the band, but that looks like is that a naked woman? There's a couple on here. Minarets, architecture, a hand. And I remember when I was like 16 or 17, this is kind of one of those things you just look at while you listen to the album, and it would keep you focused on the album. Look at that. What great details. Every time you look at it, you see new things. Have a sea monster, Loch Ness monster type looking creature in there. More mushrooms. Wow. Unbelievable. Well, I just kind of wanted to share that Flournoy Holmes Eat a Peach album cover, and we might look at a couple others. You know, that Fire on the Mountain by Charlie Daniels, that's another one of his, among many others. It's like is that a witch? I don't know. Doesn't look necessarily like a witch, but she is kind of flying in the sky. It looks sort of like a witch in that respect. We got here. Produced by Tom Dowd with special arrangements with Phil Walden. Now, Phil Walden's another kind of Georgia Southern rock figure. He was in the I think the business end of music and promotion, but he was involved with a bunch of great music. And I think he was one of the liaisons between the important relationship between the Allman Brothers and a great Georgia governor, Jimmy Carter. I don't want to get too political, but Jimmy Carter is a good man. I don't know if he was a good president, but I met him, and I had dinner with Jimmy Carter once with three other people. It was and he's a good man, and he was a good Georgia Southerner too, by the way, and a good old Southern Democrat, and not as liberal as you might think either, by the way. Jimmy Carter was a good man, a good, sensible, smart man. I always thought the Iran hostage crisis and Paul Volcker did him in, the Fed. But anyway, I remember Jimmy Carter's presidency, and I might talk about that another time. But Phil Walden was kind of old Georgia, and it was, knew Jimmy Carter. Because Jimmy Carter was a Georgia, talked to a lot of older people. They'll remember Jimmy Carter in a different way than a lot of people who just know him from the years of his presidency and afterwards. But I just wanted to share that. Let's zoom out a little bit. What amazing art. And something is that connection between the art and the music is so powerful. And I think, in history, people look at periods of art and music as they're just as important as periods of war and political change, art and music and culture, because it's such a enriching part of studying history. And I sometimes think maybe this is the more recent past, so it doesn't always get put into the same box, but this was a great period of art and music. And in a way, it only lasted a few years. And I hate to say it, but those mushrooms and the freedom that people had, where you could play from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. and just do these epic jams like that for thousands of people. And it was like a big party. It was just a great, great time for music. And that painting is as much a part of this album as the music itself. And I'm glad to see it's around again. But like I said, all these songs, that's one problem. On the internet, you've got you people listen to them on YouTube or iTunes, and you don't get that album packaging, which wasn't just packaging in a commercial sense. It was, this is part of the creative output of the album. That art was just absolutely essential part of this album. And for all those years it disappeared and you couldn't even see it. I'm like that other guy. He looked for this painting all through the 90s, and I remember that too, among other things that I'd grown up with. All through the 90s you couldn't get it. When the internet came out, finally you could start to see some of this stuff again. But there was a good 10, 15 year period where all this stuff was just gone. All these great paintings. If you had the album, of an old beat up copy of the album, you could look at it, but otherwise it was just out, out of print, out of sight, out of mind. So Flournoy Holmes, I hope I'm saying that right. It's got kind of a cool name. For some reason I find that a very southern name, like Forrest Richard Betts. But just unbelievable. I'm going to check on this. I'm just doing this with my cell phone, and I hope the images are good enough. But if not, I'll maybe redo them, because there's some good stuff in here. Thanks, everybody. Flournoy Holmes, Eat a Peach. Definitely one of the great albums of all time in rock music history. And if you like Fillmore East, this is really an extension of Fillmore East and not inferior. It's 50% live album, maybe more. I'm not sure. Yeah, One Way Out's live. Now that I think about it, so quite a bit of this is live. And of course, Duane Allman died. I don't think he was around when it was released, and I'm not even sure if he's on all the tracks. I don't know if he's on. So he might have died while they were kind of finishing this up. I'd have to check the dates, but it's got a bunch of live stuff on it, so you could call it a live album, at least a lot of it. Duane's death, After this, they came out with Brothers and Sisters, and you know what? You got to give props to Dickie Betts, because that was a big loss, and Dickie Betts took over the helm of the guitar duties. I think that, Les Dudek was a guitar player. I don't know that much about him, but I used to hear people talk about Les Dudek, and down here in Georgia, more people know Les Dudek. He was on some of that Brothers and Sisters, but they've always had good guitar players. But this was Dwayne's the last notes he ever played on a recording that was released, I think, are on this. I mean, in his time. I mean, they probably released posthumous stuff and all, but anyway. Well, I'm going to check this out and see if the camera's jerking around or too much or not. If it is, I'll redo it. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this awesome album cover art. Thanks. God bless.